Well, thank you very much, Anna, for that very kind introduction. And let me also thank the onliNEOLITHIC team for inviting me to participate in this remarkable series of seminars that they've organized for last year and this year. I'm going to go straight to my talk, so I'm going to share my screen and I hope this this works. So hopefully you can all see my first slide now.
Yeah.
Yes, fantastic. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, this evening I'm going to talk about the flow of ideas in the early Neolithic of Southwest Asia. Oh, changing, hang on. And my presentation is going to have 3 sections. I'm going to initially talk about the flow of ideas through hunter-gatherer social networks in Southwest Asia, from which the Neolithic emerged. And I don't think there's anything controversial or new within that. It will really be a bit of a review. Then I'm going to talk about the site of Wadi Fannan 16, or WF16 as it's often called, as a place of seasonal social gatherings in the southern Levant. And then thirdly, I'll suggest there is evidence from WF16 for the flow of ideas between the south and the north of our region during the early Neolithic, not specifying which direction those ideas are necessarily flowing in, although I may well make a provocative and possibly troublemaking statement towards the end of my talk regarding that. So this talk is drawing on the outcome of 2 projects, both of which highly collaborative, and so I want to acknowledge my collaborators right at the start. One is the excavations of WF16 between 2008 and 2010, published within the volume you can see there. And I'm hugely indebted to Bill Finlayson, Darko Maricevic, Sam Smith, Emma Jenkins, and Mohammed Najjar for working with me on that project. And secondly, the People and Birds in the Southern Levant project. And for that project, I'm hugely grateful to the expertise and the contributions coming from Judith White, Faris Khoury, Cheryl McAvey, Ben Greet, and Bill Finlayson. So although all the ideas here are my talk, it's absolutely dependent on that collaborative research. So let me start by just saying how I conceive of the Neolithic. I think how I think archaeologists conceive of the Neolithic today, and how people in the past thought about it, is as a set of concepts about the world and how to act within it. And if you take that view, there are as many Neolithics as there were people in the Neolithic period. We all share concepts and ideas with others, either very closely with those who are kin and we live with, or more distantly with others. So the Neolithic, a set of concepts about the world and how to act within it. And those concepts arose from the flow of ideas through social networks of hunter-gatherers that connected people throughout Southwest Asia. Nothing new of that. We're all familiar with this from hunter-gatherer research. And some of the ways of viewing the world and the behavior it resulted becomes manifest in material culture, which then allows us to track those flows of ideas. So in the northern Levant, for instance, with this remarkably rich art, architecture, iconography, however one wants to describe it, one can find similar themes, symbols from the Lower Euphrates Valley around Jeff al-Mer up to the northern Levant in the vicinity of Göbekli Tepe, then over into the upper Tigris Basin. And that's all been very nicely summed up by Marion Benz and Joachim Bauer in their phrase, a common ideological background for the whole area, from northwestern Syria to southeastern Anatolia. And that must arise from these flows of ideas and people and information across that whole northern region. Now in the southern Levant, I think similar flows of ideas, and we can see some specific items of material culture that might indicate that. So for instance, those two little objects there, one is a incised pebble from Netiv Hagdud in the Jordan Valley on the eastern side, and the other rectangular one is a little stone plaque from WF16 on the western side and on the eastern side in Wadi Araba. And you can see the iconography is very similar, slightly different arranged, but one doesn't think that just was risen by chance. And then we have similar stone beads, such as the double-holed greenstone bead that I think Leo was telling us recently is found at Nahal and Gev, and we find that in WF16 as well, showing that the epipaleolithic early PPNA in this region is much of a muchness in terms of a cultural entity. So we have east-west flows in both regions. Now, what about flows of ideas from the south to the north and back to the south again, or whichever directions? Well, clearly we have some evidence of some. So there's Anatolian obsidian found at Jericho, Netiv Hagdud and Dra. It's got there somehow, either by chains of exchange or actual people moving. There's arguments that the practice of skull removal as a mortuary behavior began in the late Natufian and south and gradually spread up to the northern Levant. And of course, Elkine points are ubiquitous throughout the region. So all these indicate there are chains of connection. And Ian Hodder and Lynn Meskel sum this up, perhaps rather half-heartedly once, as talking about the threads of common concern between the north and the south. Now, these ideas, both within those regions and across the whole area of Southwest Asia, would have been flowing within and between social networks. Now, there's obviously hunter-gatherer social networks have been around for many years, and I quite like the recent work by Hamilton and his colleagues published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, where they made a very substantive cross-cultural global study of hunter-gatherers to argue that these are those sort of structures, the hierarchies we find in hunter-gatherer social networks, each one increasing by order of 4. So starting with the individual, we then have individuals as members of families. And families live together within residential groups. And you can see that this going up by the order of 4. And then residential groups tend to aggregate seasonally for their whatever group activity they have at those aggregation sites. And then less frequently, perhaps annually or less often than that, those groups will join with other groups to make these periodic aggregations that they argue average between 150 and 180 people. And then they are part of a whole population, which is required to maintain population viability. So all hunter-gatherers live in these hierarchy of social networks that are spread across the landscape and provide chains of connection across vast distances. Now, we might like to speculate how they would map on to our early Neolithic in the Southwest Asia. And in this speculative diagram, I've suggested that those red dots are, of course, our archaeological sites, which we think are the residential base for groups, several families, with varying degrees of sedentism. And of course, here I'm slightly mixing up sites from different periods, but varying degrees of sedentism. And then those yellow areas, they might well be the boundaries for the seasonal aggregations of residential groups. I've tried to put these over clear topographic areas like key areas of river valleys or watersheds within these residential groups are living. And then we might speculate that in those blue areas would be those periodic aggregations when larger groups are coming together, maybe annually, maybe less frequently than that. And the red and the green might be even larger aggregations, or possibly the entire breeding populations, or the extent of these social networks, how they ultimately overlap and connect people all the way from the south to the north. Now, of course, we don't really know how these social networks map on, but that's broadly how I think we should be conceiving of the early Neolithic hunter-gatherers in Southwest Asia. And these social networks served several ecological functions. It wasn't only ideas flowing through them, it was information, material items, and people. And these functioned to maintain food security by both exchanging foodstuffs, exchanging information about resource distributions on landscape, so that people could remap themselves onto the landscape to exploit those effectively. We know that social aggregations help to resolve social tensions and they mitigate conflict. And there's good studies show how people engaging in social networks tend to enhance their levels of cooperation and be able to work together. And these social networks and the social gatherings are critical for maintaining population viability. And again, recent studies have demonstrated those who engage in these social networks achieve higher levels of reproductive success than those who don't. Now, in the archaeological record, we've got some good candidates for possible locations of these seasonal and or periodic gatherings. Göbekli Tepe, of course, the obvious example, that remarkable investment in architecture and art surely must be for major gatherings of people annually, seasonally, less often, coming from wide areas across the landscape. And similarly, Jericho. I worry that Jericho becomes rather neglected in discussions about the early these days, but we've got that huge monumental architecture there. And as I think it was Ian quite years ago argued, it's probably at the pinnacle of some settlement hierarchy. But here, another classic candidate, I think, for major gatherings of people from large areas of the landscape. And then at sites such as Halan Chemi and Jefalama, we've got large structures that have been argued, I think persuasively, that these are also for major ceremonial gatherings, probably of people coming from not as distant or not as large social area, but certainly coming from different residential groups gathering at these sites. And then the last one is the one at the bottom, Wadi Fanan 16. And I'm now going to talk about Wadi Fanan 16 as a possible location for seasonal gatherings by people coming from across the southern Levant. Oh, before I do so, just to note that what's happening at these gatherings, these seasonal or periodic ones, where people are coming together from across the landscape, they're bringing their ideas, their concepts with them, and during whatever talking, chatting, ceremony, ritual, singing, dancing, whatever happens, their concepts about the world are reformulated, as is their ideas of how to act within it. And then they disperse again and take those concepts and they share them with other people who weren't necessarily at those meetings. And of course, that also happens at any gathering. At this gathering of the online Neolithic group, I'm hoping to reformulate your concepts about the Neolithic so that you change your ideas about that time of the world. Whether I'll be successful in that, I rather doubt. But anyway, let's move on down to the southern Levant and Wadi Fanan 16. And I'm now going to take 10 or 15 minutes talking about this particular site and especially the analysis of the bird bones from it. So here's the Wadi Fanan 16, looking towards the end of the 2010 excavations. And here we're looking towards the west, towards Wadi Araba, down along Wadi Fanan. And we can see the excavation then, and at that northern end, you can see this large circular or subcircular structure being excavated at the time then. And if we go back into the early Holocene, we've got to imagine a river running along that wadi, a much greener landscape, a much richer landscape than we have in this rather arid environment today. And here we are looking eastwards. And here you can see that the settlement is on a low gravel knoll. just at the base where a wadi Gwir it's called, emerges from this canyon. And in the background there, you're looking up towards the Jordanian plateau. So Wadi Fanan 16 is located in a really interesting location, topographic location, that allows access to people coming from various parts of the landscape. To its east, we've got the major north-south highway of Wadi Araba. And then from Wadi Araba, there's access along Wadi Fanan, passing through this through this granite barrier here to Fanan there. And then to the east, they're the highlands of the Jordanian plateau. But two steep cut wadis, Wadi Dana and Wadi Gwir, lead directly down to WF16. So topographically, it seems well situated as a location for gatherings of people coming from dispersed settlements across the landscape. And here's looking more closely at the location of the site. You can see it, it's at that blue square there in this image from Google Earth, just above where today the wadi widens out just after leaving the geological porphyry of the canyon. And there you can see the site plan of this dense cluster of semi-subterranean Pisé-built structures, some of which we believe to be dwellings, some workrooms, and some storerooms. And then we've got this rather large structure that, to be honest, we don't really know what it is. And here you can see a picture of those Pisé semi-subterranean dwellings towards the end of the 2010 excavation. Quite good preservation, especially that one in the center, which had burned down and been rather better preserved by that means. Chronologically, we have about 43 radiocarbon dates, and you can see the SCPD from them in the bottom there. So they suggest a spread of activity between about 11.8 and 10.2 thousand years ago, with a tight cluster around 11.2. Now that is partly enhanced by a calibration effect, as you can see there, but that's only partly contributing to it. And I'm pretty sure that the majority of activity that we're looking at in that slide of these Pisé-built dwellings happened in the few centuries around 11.2 Ka. Now we suspect there's earlier activity here, because we've only excavated about 20% of the deposits here. And there's various lines of evidence suggests there's epipaleolithic settlement below these levels, which we haven't radiocarbon dated. And equally, we know that a huge amount of the settlement has been eroded from the surface of the site before we started excavation. So we expect that the Neolithic remains continue later in time as well. So we're really seeing a truncated chronology here, dictated by what's eroded and by what we've been able to excavate. Now, here we're looking at this large structure at the northern end of the site, known as O75. In the bottom right of your screen, you can see a later freestanding circular structure that was built on top of it, we think at about 10.8 Ka in the last phase of settlement here. But if we put that to one side at the moment, we can see this remarkable structure all built out of Pisé, mud clay with some temper put in, on what we think is a stone substructure to it. It's got a, well, let me move on. It's got a strange trough down the middle of it, which bisects it in two. Here we've got a little sondage that we dug that shows there are certainly early deposits, including stone vessels, below this particular floor level here. It's got two benches around the side, a lower and an upper bench, two benches surviving, there may have been more. And this is a decorated face. It seems to be partitioned with these either gullies or ridges that seem to partition it up. And there's substantive holes here, quite shallow, but where large posts appear to have been removed, as well as molded post pipes in the Pisa infrastructure. There's two couple mortars which are embedded in the floor at this end, and a range of other stake holes. Now, we can't find any archaeological precedent or comparator to this. And as much as I've searched, I can't find a good ethnographic analogy either. So we still are a slightly dilemma whether this was once an open structure for some sort of performance or some really large covered domestic sort of structure. My colleague Darko Mricevic made this speculative reconstruction, suggesting that it may have been at least partly roofed with reeds, and that these gullies had in fact made partitions that may have been divided with fabric screens. But this is speculation. We don't really understand what this structure may have looked like, and there's various different scenarios could be derived. Now, as well as this remarkable architecture, WF16 is also notable for the southern Levant for having a particularly large quantity of stone and shell beads. There's something like 450 of both types, coming in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And also large quantities of, or relatively large quantities of fragments of stone vessels, stone plaquettes and bone plaquettes, which are decorated with incised geometric designs, and there's a sample of them there. The site has about 30 burials dug into floors and walls, most of them coming, we think, from the final phase of activity, which are then dug into those Pisa structures that we're just seeing, although there's certainly some early burials probably going to right back to the start of the settlement in the very earliest centuries of the 12th millennium BP. And then the site also has particularly large quantities of bird bones. I'm now going to talk about the bird bones for a while, because I think they give us a good evidence for types of activities happening at the site. Well, there were over almost 18,000 bird bones excavated from the site. And I say we've only removed possibly 20% of deposits at most. And there were almost 8,000 of those which are identified to taxa. And this work, and the Cartmart work I referred to, was undertaken by Judith White, part of the Birds and People team. The removal of the bird bones was done by Cheryl, and then Judith classified those and undertake the analysis. And you can see here that it's a diverse assemblage with 18 different bird families represented, but about 90% of the bones, the ones identified, are coming from raptors. A huge domination of those, but nevertheless showing this diversity of birds. And when we look at the raptors, there's at least 20 types of eagles, vultures, harriers, kites, and so forth represented, but again dominated by at about 68% by one particular taxa, and that's the steppe buzzard. Huge quantity of buzzard bones from the site. So a very striking bird bone assemblage. And if we compare it with the larger bird bones assemblages from elsewhere in our region, we can see it has both similarities and differences. So on the chart on the top right there, it shows the range of species and the range of families. That's just the number of them. at comparator sites such as Hallan Chemi, Jeffel Net of Hagdud, Ohalo, Shibaya. And it shows WF16 is very similar in terms of the range of the number of different taxa present. But when you look at the diversity, WF16 has a very low diversity, very different from other sites because of this huge dominance of raptors at WF16. If we look at the spatial distribution of the bird bones within the settlement, they're coming from most of the structures we've excavated, but there's particularly high densities in two of these. One of them at the bottom right is structure 011, where, and you can actually see in that picture of some of the excavated deposits, just a mass of bird bones. I think there's 52 articulating sets of buzzard claws buzzard talons from this one horizon here. That seems to be a place where they're actually processing buzzard carcasses. And then another high density of bird bones comes from this very small structure here, 056. Now, this is very small. You can hardly crouch inside it. There seems to be a working anvil in there. And this is also the structure that we've got the highest density of stone beads from. So I think this is a place where they are making what I call bird gear, headdresses, costumes, and so forth, from feathers, from skins, and from stone and probably shell beads. Or it might be where that items are being stored when not being used in ceremonial occasions. Looking at that distribution of bird bones there, the discard patterns of them is very different to that of the mammal bones and the chipped stone. Now, this graph here shows standardized densities of these in a series of different structures. The gray and the white are the animal bone and the chipped stone. And you can see that they normally correlate. If you find a lot of chipped stone, you're finding a lot of mammal bone. And I think this is because this is all just domestic rubbish. It's just being thrown away. The bird bones have quite a different pattern. You can see in No 56, No 11, there's hardly any animal bone or chipped stone within them. And if there is, there's less than one would actually expect. So it looks like the deposition of bird bones is following a quite different pattern from that of normal domestic refuse as this site. When you look at cut marks on the bird bones and the body parts and the patterns of burning, they show that the waterfowl and the game birds, although not in huge numbers, were primarily being butchered for consumption. While for the large raptors, eagles, and the geese and the storks, these were either entirely represented by wing bones, or they carried cut marks which suggest wings and feathers are being detached. So it's a similar pattern that you find at Hallan Chemi or Ohalo or elsewhere. The buzzards give a slightly different pattern. Here, the cut marks indicate very clearly that several, maybe many of them, were actually being skinned. We did our own experimental skinning using stone tools to confirm this, and we get a very close match between the typical cut marks you get from experimental skinning and those being found on the buzzards. So some buzzards are being skinned. Some are also clearly have cut marks which seem to be about consumption, and some of the bones are burned. So they're eating some of the buzzards, but they're also skinning some of them as well. Now, in terms of seasonality, we have numerous types of waterfowl and also osprey at WF16 that never appear in these arid environments today. And they are winter visitors to Jordan and the Levant in general. Now, the increased range of waterfowl here suggests to us that Fainan had been considerably wetter in the winter period during the early Holocene. And in fact, there had probably been a localized wetland developing just close to the site. Still within a relatively arid landscape, but a wetland there, which is attracting much more waterfowl, geese, osprey than would ever go to these arid landscapes today. In the spring and autumn was the time of the migrations of buzzards and other raptors along the Wadi Araba. As I'm sure you'll all know, the Wadi Araba is this tight funnel for this remarkable annual migration of birds from Africa to Europe. Passage migrants, although some will remain in the in Southwest Asia. And Fainan is, of course, on the direct flight route of these birds. And when excavating there in the spring, you get this magnificent spectacle of these huge flocks passing across Fainan. Now, buzzards would have traveled in large flocks, and our ornithologists we work with tells us that large flocks would probably have rested in Fainan during these migrations, giving a rather good opportunity for hunting. So the interpretation for the site that we're working on at the moment is that during the winter, there was a rather small residential population at the site. Water was relatively abundant at that time, and that would have been critical for constructing and maintaining the Pise architecture. Now, I've done some experimental work on that, and building this mud architecture is hugely expensive in water. 3,000 litres just to make one tiny little structure. And you can see the extent of these structures at the site. So I think they could only have been constructed when there was locally available water nearby, which had been during the winter. In the spring and summer, we're suggesting at the moment that this was a time of relatively large gatherings. People came from across the landscape to WF16 at the time of the spring migrations. Buzzard flocks and other migratory birds were hunted. They were skinned. They provided both food, skins, feathers and wings for ceremonial costumes for ceremony and ritual that I think were probably taking place in this rather large structure of O75. So WF16 appears to me to be one of these locations where there was this reformulation of participants' concepts about the world and how to act within it. Now, that seems, I think, hopefully not too controversial, and would think of WF16 then as a melting pot for flows of ideas between the West and the East in the southern Levant. One can imagine people gathering at sites such as Jordan, such as Jericho or Netefagdud, and equally other times gathering at sites such as WF16 for these seasonal or periodic gatherings, as their ideas about the world, how to act in with it, were continuously being developed. What's perhaps more interesting is whether WF16 was also a melting pot for the flows of ideas between the South and the North, or the now North and the South, if you want to phrase it that way, during the early Neolithic. And what I want to do now to complete my talk is present some evidence that suggests this may have indeed been the case. Now, it'd be evident to everybody that there's a shared interest in raptors and other birds between the southern Levant, with the evidence I've shown from WF16, and what we find in the north. Halenchemi also has a focus on raptors where wings and feathers appear to have been removed, as does Jeffel-Amar. And then in the iconography of the northern Levant, raptors are represented at Jeffel-Amar, at Göbekli Tepe, and elsewhere. Now, this shared interest in raptors might be purely coincidental. Hunter-gatherers throughout the world have myths and stories and ceremonies to do with raptors. And so I don't think we can necessarily read anything particularly significant into this similar interest in raptors from the north and south. At that Fainan, we don't have any persuasive visual representations of birds of prey at all. But how about this? This is the decorated bench at WF16, and then comparing it with the decorated bench at Jeff El Amar. And you can see that the designs on them are, well, they're basically identical. Jeff El Amar it's molded in its mud plaster to make the zigzag line just down from the edge of the bench. And we have the same at WF16. Here it's grooved in or incised in using a finger or a stick into wet mud plaster. And I think it's not unreasonable to believe that somebody had seen one of these and have copied it, whether it's Jeff El Amar copying what was seen at WF16 or vice versa, or they're coming from some other source. I'm not clear. But that looks like to me a pretty significant similarity. Now, another similarity are miniature faces. So these miniature faces are reasonably well known from the Northern Levant. Examples from Göbekli and Nivali Kori and Jeff El Amar. The amazing little stone face is about 5 centimeters or so in size. And we have a similar face from WF16 that you can see there. Almost identical in size, a little bit different as I'll show in a moment. Now, all of these faces might have a precedent from the late Natufian. We've got there this magnificent stone face from Nahalain Gev II, probably dates maybe 500 years, maybe a bit more earlier than these other faces. Whether it's a precedent for them or something, or entirely different cultural tradition, we don't know. But this Fainan face looks pretty similar to those that are being found in the Northern Levant. It's a bit different because those in the Northern Levant either have a concave back or flat back, whereas the WF16 face has a double face. It's got this nice smiley face on both sides, so you can flip it upside down and you've still got a little smiley face, as you see there. So that's fairly unique for any anthropomorphic figure that I know of in Southwest Asia. Here's another connection. Klaus Schmidt described these two stone sculptures from Göbekli Tepe as half skeletonized figures because they appear to be depicted with their ribs emerging through their skin. And there's other examples, including those of humans from the Northern Levant. And they've been described as possibly representing signs of emaciated creatures, possibly symbolizing death. And then below is a stone, a zoomorphic figurine from WF16, which appears to show exactly the same, with these linear striations on the side that can equally be interpreted as ribs and look strikingly similar to those from the Northern Levant. It is rather smaller. It's only about 8 centimeters in size, where the two above are 60 and 90 centimeters. So they're quite monumental sculptures. This is a small figure that you can see here with incised lines on both faces. But I think it's strikingly similar to what is seen there. And here's something else, snakes. Now we know snakes are a key theme in the iconography of the Northern Levant. And there's been considerable amount written about snakes in the northern region. Well, from Wadi Fainan, we have a little mud face. Now, personally, I think that's a little mud representation of the face of a snake. My colleagues are more skeptical. They think it's an amorphous piece of mud that happens to have a couple of little holes in it, and I am reading too much into that. But look at the object next to it. This is a stone cylinder, a bit like a stone pestle, but it's got 4 snakes engraved in bas relief around the sides of it. as you can see here. One of these snakes having a forked tail. The heads of the snakes have been lost because this stone cylinder does have some flakes removed around from one end of it, presumably during use. Use for what, we don't know. But I think it's undeniable that we've got snakes here, and the snakes have a close resemblance to the manner in which snakes are depicted in the northern Levant. And here's something else, Phalli. Okay. Now, in at Göbekli Tepe, there are both so-called epiphallic figures, as you see that little man there, and on that sculptured pillar there, and also I think there's at least 3 separate phalli, little stone carvings. And we have the same at W16. We have several which are rather ambiguous, but at least 3 which I think are very persuasive phalli with varying degrees of realism. That middle one at the base there is covered in red ochre. So that seems to be another theme connecting WF16 with the northern Levant. And then we have this beautiful little carving of a animal head. Now, whether that's an ibex or a wild goat, or maybe even a dog, I'm not entirely sure. But this stone little carving from W16 is virtually identical to one that's coming from Abu Huraira. Now, the one from Abu Huraira is described as coming from the PP&B levels there, but there's no detailed contextual information about it. And I think it probably dates earlier because, you know, these carvings are really probably used as heirlooms, passed on from generation to generation. So I think it's very difficult to put precise dates on those. And you can see here that in the top right there, that the remarkable similarity between these two figures from WF16 and Abu Huraira, and this very fine little stone carving. And what about this object? This is a polished stone baton from WF16. It's about 24 centimeters in length, polished very finely from a grey and white stone, the source of which we've not been able to determine as yet, and made so it's got this brilliant white tip. I can't find any comparable artifact throughout the region other than what's described as a stone baton from Güsir in the Upper Tigris Basin. That's a little bit smaller. It's about 15 centimeters. It's also finely polished. It's made out of a green stone and it's incised with lines. Now, the WF16 example has got chips around the base of it, which I think reflects how it was once hafted into a wooden shaft. Now, what's also interesting about this object is that it was found on the floor, and you can see in the photos there, below a good case for deliberate backfill. You can see in the section through this little structure here, the object was found just near where the scale is found on the floor here. And this dumper deposit in it with these large PCA blocks has no stratigraphy, no floor layers. So it seems that it was a deliberate backfill, one of the very few examples we've got from that from WF16. And I'd find it very unlikely that this beautiful baton was left on that floor accidentally or lost or forgotten about. So I think this is a deliberate sealing of this artifact below this dumper deposits, probably because of some potent ritual power that it was still possessing. A couple of other similarities with the North. A number of years ago, a drilled piece of human crania was published with good evidence that this was once suspended at Göbekli Tepe. And we have the same at W16, a piece of human crania, which is either pierced or drilled. And from another structure, we have fragments of a smashed crania, which looks like it was once suspended within this structure before the roof collapsed and broke it across the floor. So here's another interesting similarity. And here's another one. Some of the burials at W16 have black pigment on the bones. This is the best example where the rear of this cranium has a series of parallel black bands marked on. Now, whether they are painted on or whether imprints from wrappings isn't clear. Now you can see there is also some plaster on the skull. The closest similarities come from a skull from Hasankeyf-Hoyuk, where there is also parallel black bands painted or imprinted onto a cranium. There they're rather thinner and more numerous. They're not shown terribly well in that photograph, but as you'll be aware, there's other bones from Kortek Tepe and Hasankeyf-Hoyuk, which have also got black pigment on, similar to what we're finding at W16. And then we also have the use of plaster. Some of the bones at W16 are seem to be wrapped in plaster wrappings, this one seeming to have the imprints of some fabric on top of it. And of course, we have the same at El Hema, where one of the seated burials seems to have had a lot of plaster dumped on top of it. Now, whether that's equivalent or slightly different, I don't know. But then at Kortek Tepe, we have these remarkable burials where thick layers of plasters has been used covering the bones, which seems to be very similar to theme to what we're finding in the south. Now, of course, the use of pigment on skeletal remains and the use of plaster on burials has epipaleolithic precedents in the southern Levant. We've got pigments on human skeletal remains from Azraq 18 and from Shabaika, and a burial at Nahalain Gav has plaster placed over the bones. So these seem to me to provide a precedent for both what we find at W16 and potentially also what we're finding in the northern Levant in the upper Tigris region. So what I've done is shown a number of similarities in the what we call art objects or artifacts and the treatment of human bodies coming from W16 to what we're finding in the northern Levant. Snakes and half skeletonized animals, miniature faces, phallic imagery, stone baton, an interest in raptors, pierced and drilled human crania. And the question is, are these just coincidental? Is this just independent invention? Well, I think that's unlikely. And I think what this is reflecting is a more substantive flow of ideas between the north and the south of the Levant than we'd previously appreciated, suggesting there's much more than mere threads of common concern that was once cited. And of course, the key question is, where are all these ideas starting? And the one, well, maybe more, but the one provocative suggestion I'll make is that this is all starting in the south. Because what we have in the southern Levant are the precedents for stone faces, for use of pigment and plaster on human burials. And I'm wondering whether these other concepts to which these artifacts are relating is also starting in the south. And these ideas are spreading in the north through those social networks. And of course, it's in the north where they become particularly elaborated. They become expressed in a most astonishing fashion, as in the Neolithic cultures there thrive. I think probably much more so than do in the south, probably simply for environmental factors relating to the early Holocene. Now, finally, what was the invisible force in my title? What is the invisible force that's driving these social networks, that's driving the exchange of concepts and the formulation of concepts? Well, It's just words. It's words, it's language. The Neolithic must have been a remarkable time for the invention of new words. And the invention of new words are necessary to anchor concepts, to exchange concepts, to build a more complex concepts. And what's happening at these social gatherings are people talking to each other, telling them each other about their world, how they think about their world, what they believe. And I think those words, the use of language, is really the force ultimately that's driving the conceptual developments, the behavioral developments through the Neolithic. Now, I have written a paper on this in the Journal of Social Archaeology, and I just flagging that up there at the end of my talk, and just noting that this is a future area of research for myself, trying to understand more about how words would have been the driver for the cultural change of the Neolithic. But let me finish now by summarizing. I've argued that the Neolithic emerged and developed through the ideas, the information, the materials, and the people that flowed through hunter-gatherer social networks. And these led to new concepts about the world and how to act within it. I then argued that the site of Wadi Finan 16 was a place of seasonal social gatherings in the southern Levant, where ceremonies and rituals involved the use of bird skins and feathers. It's got the topographic location for that. It's got the architecture for that. And it's got the bird bones to suggest that they're being used in this manner. And then finally, I suggested WF16 as evidence for a more substantive flow of ideas between the South and the North during the early Neolithic than we might have previously appreciated. The treatments of human bodies and the type of artifacts being made, and posed the question, did the concepts that these derive from arise in the South during that Natufian period, only to become most elaborately expressed in the North? And finally, I've just made the statement, not one I'm prepared to defend at the moment, that was the invention of new words that ultimately drove the formulation of concepts and culture change. So finally, I want to thank again my colleagues, Bill, Darko, Sam, Emma, Mohammed, who led the excavation W16, and all of the students, especially those coming from the University of Reading, who undertook the excavation. And then Judith, Bill, Faris, Cheryl, and Ben for the work on the Birds project. The AHRC, Arts Humanities Research Council UK, for funding both of these projects. The University of Reading, that's given me such support over so many years. And finally, the onliNEOLITHIC group for inviting me to talk today. And of course, for everybody for listening to what I've got to say. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Steve. That was really, how do we say, a flight of force, actually. And we are open for questions, remarks, whatever comes to your mind. You can either raise your hand, but I have 5 screens in front of me. So maybe better is to ask through the chat. While we are waiting, I would like to ask you one question, or actually it's a comment. I don't know whether you've seen the Calorient of 2020, which there is a paper by Birkenfeld et al. About a PPNB site.
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
Yeah, Nahal
Rodin,
that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
I mean, go on.
No.
Yes, I have. My understanding is that that has the same themes of a dominance of raptors. And
they have only raptors.
Only raptors, that's right.
Yeah.
And it's on a rather high cliff top, really, isn't it? So, yeah. And I don't think there's any actual structures there at all.
No, there are. I think.
Oh, there are. Yeah.
I don't see, but Daniela Barriuset,
yeah,
is one of the co-authors on that paper. Maybe she can enlarge upon.
Yeah, I think it follows that theme of, you know, you're there down, but that's further south, was right down near Aqaba, where all these flocks would have been coming across, where it's really spectacle. I'm sure they're standing on top of this mountain trying to shooting some of these birds with the bows and arrows and having some success, or poisoning them or something. So I think this theme of interest in raptors right in the southern Levant is continuing into the PP&D and later. Yeah. It's a remarkable site. It's a wonderful site. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, I would like to say something in general. When you were showing the structure O75, you said that you were looking for ethnographic
parallel.
Parallels. You know? And no, I don't have, but I think that we should all remember that we are dealing really with something which is really difficult and for the first time. So I'm sure that a lot of things that we see in the Neolithic are either endeavors that failed, and we are trying desperately to see them either continuing or parallel, or things that were abandoned. I mean, we all accept that the Neolithic is, you know, full of new ideas, new enterprises, new stuff. And not everything continued all along. And it's very difficult to sift, you know, between stuff that stayed and evolved and stuff that disappeared.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. I think looking for ethnographic parallels is maybe a fool's errand to some extent. But just trying to work out what the superstructure might have been like, what it was used for is a challenge. Is a challenge, because it looks like a theatre, but then it has all these structural features in that suggests there's some infrastructure there. So it's quite difficult.
There is one question here that I see by Jeffrey Summers. Can you ask Jeffrey yourself the question, or should I read it? I don't see him, but
I can answer. I can see the question. How do you think these raptors were caught? Well, yes, very interesting question, isn't it? I've had a long chat with Faris, who's an ornithologist from Jordan, who I work with. He thinks catching buzzards wouldn't have been so tricky, because when they're migrating, they would come and settle in flocks in Fenan in a fairly exhausted state and roost in trees. And he thinks that adept hunter-gatherers would have been able to capture them in nets, clubbing them, shooting them, and so forth. Traps are a bit more problematic, or poison is a bit more problematic. Buzzards aren't known to take bait. Eagles and vultures are, they could be caught like that, but buzzards aren't known to do that. So they may have done that. There's a huge number of alkine points, arrowheads, shaft straighteners. So I think some might have been shot with arrows, although we haven't actually found any arrowhead impact marks on the bones themselves. I think some of them might have been scavenged as well from dead animals that they find. But it's a really interesting idea how they could how you capture these birds. It's a really challenging one, and I don't have that many answers.
There is also a question by Marion. Marion, please.
Yes.
Can you unmute your microphone?
Okay, thank you very much for this great talk. It was very inspiring. I'm just thinking aloud, and I was wondering whether the model of concentric circles is appropriate for representing the very flexible structure of hunter-gatherers. And I think it's only with the Neolithic that communities start to be more circumscribed or even confined. And this is one comment, and another short comment perhaps on the origin of your ideas from the south. I think we just don't have enough evidence from the north to say anything about the Epipaleolithic.
Yeah,
that's the problem.
Yeah, well, let me just answer both of those. I mean, I think those social networks of hunter-gatherers, I think they go way back earlier in time. I think, you know, Neanderthals are living in social networks of hunter-gatherers, and in the Upper Paleolithic, Epipaleolithic, these are really vast. I very much like the work you've written about how in the Neolithic with sedentism, they are to some extent breaking down because of the social stress happening within the more sedentary communities. So, but I think broadly we've got, probably as you've argued, we've got a transition from that traditional hunter-gatherer social network into something which is changing, probably as a consequence of sedentism and the greater investment in architecture. I see in your chat you've noted the reference to Dunbar, and you've referenced Dunbar's number before. There's Hamilton's work is interesting where it references Dunbar. Dunbar's work on networks tend to move up in scales of 3. Hamilton's much more sophisticated analysis of ethnographic studies suggests that Dunbar's isn't quite as good, and actually it should move up in scales of 4. But these are all, you know, much of a muchness, really. I think we just need to recognize that sometimes there would have been social gatherings of either a smaller or greater extent, and that's how ideas are flowing about. Your last comment about the lack of epipaleolithic in the north, yeah, I absolutely agree. From what I've read, there are epipaleolithic deposits in the upper Tigris basin, but they're not terribly well defined or dated, and I can't work out quite what artifacts coming from those. Moving over into northern Mesopotamia, we don't have anything there, and equally, you know, the dating of these artifacts from Göbekli Tepe are problematic because of the lack of in situ deposits, because of the amount of PP&B activity there, and all the deliberate backfilling. So, so we are rather stuck as to looking at that origin, which is why I'd venture to say, well, at least in the south, we have got the epipaleolithic down there. We know there's lots of interesting things happening in Indonesian. We've got good dates on these from W16. So let's fly something that all this stuff is starting in the north, and actually you don't have it in the epipaleolithic in north, but you know, yeah. I'm just being a bit provocative there.
No, yeah. That's fine.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
I think, yeah, we are all struggling with where it began or how it began. I mean,
yeah.
There are so many papers on that, and everyone has his own opinion. Anyway, sorry, Nikos, do you want to ask a question? Your hand is raised. No, I think it was a mistake, maybe. And then Bulent, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrongly. Can you ask your question? You have actually 2. I see in the chat.
I can see the question there.
Okay, go on. And then there is also, so we'll make order. After Bulent, there is Oslam, which also wrote the question in the chat, but then there is Nurshan, and she simply raised her hand. So once you respond to the written ones, Nurshan will have her option, opportunity to ask. Go on.
Okay. Let me just comment for a few. And I'm sorry if I pronounce names wrong. Bulent has asked about, I think, new sites in the Göbekli Tepe region. Yes, of course. I mean, these are all part of that hunter-gatherer social network. My maps have only put a few sites on, and it's just remarkable how that Neolithic record in the northern Levant is developing. Oslem, if one would find the similar early finds in the north, how would you interpret? Well, I'm not particularly interested in origins, and I think what's happening is there's a constant flow of ideas circulating throughout the Southwest Asia and beyond. And I don't think origins is a particularly interesting question. I think it's how they develop and they build and they add to each other. Words are continually being invented. You know, we've seen that during COVID pandemic, how frequently we invent words, and suddenly once we've invented words, we've got a new concept in our mind. And so I'm not hung up on the idea of origins. What I am hung up on is that the whole of Southwest Asia is connected in flow of ideas and a flow of people and flow of information. And from that, the Neolithic emerges. And in some areas, especially in the northern Levant, it becomes particularly material, if you like, particularly elaborate and particularly extravagant, which might be purely for environmental reasons. But it only does so possibly from contributions from much earlier that may have originated in the south. I don't care where it starts really. What I do care about is understanding that this is a widespread social network of flowing of ideas and concepts. Yeah, so I think that answers the other questions down there. We don't need to find a cultural origin, but it's always quite nice to find, you know, the first of things or where things start, but that's probably a rather trivial exercise to understanding how things develop and how culture changes over time.
Nushan, please.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking that how, you know, you explained the horizontal type of flow of ideas.
Yes.
And I was wondering the you know, vertical version of it.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking that you know, I was working at Çatalhöyük, and then I was thinking about some interesting similarities, like the vulture depiction, for instance. Probably everybody noticed. I mean, who knows Neolithic in general? And I think it was the Cerfel Ahmar, no?
Yeah.
In the
Yeah.
in the stone and the wall painting, and then also skeletonized body. Let's say we have human version of it. And you know, like bird wings, crane, birds, and our animal bone team was were thinking that it's also used like costume and stuff like that. So, and also in Anatolia, I was thinking that especially this on this you know, the time can be too different than, you know, the time can be how do you say, the time difference can be longer than this, and very strange similarities are happening. You know, you can draw a vulture in millions other ways maybe, but why are you doing this in this way? Really specifically the type, the style is sometimes strikingly similar. How do you see that?
Yeah. I mean, I'd agree with you. I mean, I think as others such as Lynn Mescaline, Hodder, Marion Benz, and others have argued, there is a, you know, the ideology that seems to be represented in the Northern Levant and the PPNA seems to overlap very significantly of what is found in Çatalhöyük. There's similar themes within it of death, birds of prey, masculinity that has been argued, and so forth. And I think just what I'm showing is that some of those themes are also evident way in the Southern Levant, probably in an even earlier time. So if you've got a nexus of ideas there, a nexus of concept symbols that substantiate an ideology that seems to have been persistent, to be resilient through thousands of years of economic change, going from mobile hunter-gatherers to the sedentary farmers that you find at Çatalhöyük. Let me just make two other comments. One is, we've always got to be careful, just because we find a depiction of a vulture in one place and a vulture in another place, that it necessarily implies the same belief, that the symbol was being used in the same way. It doesn't necessarily imply that at all. So you may have snakes in one area that are a good thing and snakes in another area that are a bad thing, whatever. So just because we get the similar iconography, it doesn't necessarily imply the same beliefs, the same ideology. But also the persistence of ideas through time is extremely interesting. That pestle-like object from W16 with the snakes on, you'd have seen how worn that is. Now, I think that's been handled year in, year out for generations and generations, and it's passed down through generations. So the material culture acts as a means for transmitting symbols, at least, if not ideas, through generations, through time. And these objects can act as heirlooms. They can be lost, and then they can be rediscovered again. I made the comment about the little head of the gazelle or goat, or whatever, at Abu Huraira, come from PP&B deposits. Not well dated, but looks virtually identical to that from WF16. So is this something that's got lost and then refound and reused? And we know that's the way people, you know, operate. So we do have that passage through time, either by deliberate or accidental processes. And there seems to be this ideology covering a very wide area, stretching into Anatolia and extending into the Neolithic. So I'm totally in the same mind as you, finding all these links really fascinating. And I think it does show the extent, horizontal and vertical extent of these hunter-gatherer social networks.
Tobias Richter.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Thanks very much for your thoughtful talk. It's given me a lot of things to think about for sure. But I want to play a little bit the devil's advocate, perhaps. And it seems to me that the evidence, the material you chose to highlight these networks is could be described as a little bit piecemeal, an object here, an object there, whereas some of the most ubiquitous material we have, the stone, chipped stone artifacts, you sort of only very briefly mentioned. So I sort of get the feeling that there's more work to be done, I suppose. And considering that, we're talking about quite a large geographic area with a lot of people in it, of course, not quite as many as nowadays, but still a lot of people. When you talk about concepts and words, I was sort of thinking about what I think Bill also recently talked about or published on, how many languages would people have been speaking in the region? Was this one language family? I mean, I know there's no way in which we can possibly hope to reconstruct this, but it would seem to me over such a large area that people would probably have spoken quite a lot of different languages and dialects. And how easily would concepts have been translated? And we've all, probably played Chinese whispers at some point in our lives. And how many misunderstandings could there have been? So I kind of wonder sometimes whether we really, want to see social networks and see social networks because we want to see them, but are things really that straightforward?
Okay, that's really, really, really interesting comment. Let me just make two responses. On the first one about not talking about stone tools or patterns of exploitation, I've deliberately tried to avoid patterns of behavior that might be ecological responses to the environment.
Right.
So some types of, stone tool technology might be just a response to you hunt gazelle here, you hunt gazelle there. That's the most efficient way to do it. It's more likely that's to be independent inventions arising out of similar sort of technology or similar way of exploiting gazelle and things like that. So I think focusing on what would term more symbolic artifacts tries to escape that you're just looking at ecological response to environments rather than necessarily social networks. But I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I'm from W16, we're just picking out a few artifacts because you only have a few artifacts. This is all we've got. And of course, if there was just one of these, like a miniature face, you might say, well, that's just coincidence. But what I'm saying is when you find that collection of half skeletonized animals, snakes, phallic objects, it almost gets too many to just be a coincidence, even though the number of them are very, very few down in the south. The language thing is very interesting. I mean, I am also sympathetic to the idea that across Southwest Asia in the Neolithic, I suspect there were multiple languages being spoken. The analogy would of course be with New Guinea, where almost every single village has its own language.
Right.
And I think that is a good model for Southwest Asia. I'm not quite sure why I think it's a good model, but I'm sure it is a good model. But we have to remember that those people in New Guinea, they could speak 3 or 4 languages. The idea, with us today, where we have one language, and if you're particularly clever, you might speak another one. If you're really clever, you can speak 3 or 4. That's unusual. The normal situation for people in the past, in traditional community, had been able to speak or at least converse in multiple different languages. And often languages share particular words. So I agree with you about, can you have the same concept or you have a different language? Well, you can if you have a similar words that can be translated in it. And of course, we sometimes in English adopt languages, words from other languages when we don't have the concept where we think it might be a useful concept. So it's really interesting, those ideas and issues you raise. And they're the things I'm actually wanting to work on and think about as we're moving forward. But the idea that there's multiple languages going on, and why I called it an invisible force is invisible for us. I have no idea how we can ever make any substantive progress on this other than just mere speculation. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but there you go.
Oh, it's a good answer. I mean, having kids that actually speak 3 languages, I should have thought about that answer myself.
Yeah, okay.
So thank you.
well, clever kids.
Well,
good luck to them. Yeah.
I think that all the rest of the questions are in the chat, and you can see them yourself.
Hi,
Steven, there is a question by Boulant, another question. Then it's Alexander Vasse, and then Ilmaz.
Okay. Did we find any wall paint? Yeah, there's red pigment on the face of the bench, and it looks like there's been multiple replasterings of it with red pigment on. And elsewhere at W16 on one floor, there was red pigment on a floor. There's no painted images that I can recall, but there's clearly is use of pigment, red pigment going on, and some of the artifacts have red pigment on. Alexander says, how do you interpret Simio's identification of early PP that contemporary? Mine's probably just some north-south flows with an early PP material culture context. If so, what that might mean for culture flow? Well, to be honest, I haven't really thought about that actually. Might this imply the existence of north-south flows within a? Yes, indeed. I'm sure there's north-south flows, east-west flows, south-north flows happening in the PP&B, just as there are in the PP&A. And I do think that, you know, we've got to face up to the recognition that our traditional culture categories of Epipaleolithic, Natufian, PP&A, PP&B really flow into each other much more, perhaps especially in the Southern Levant, than we've been prepared to otherwise. You know, a classic case from my point of view is the keep finding similarities between W16 and Nahala and Gev, the late Natufian sites, which, you know, should be 1,000 years earlier, but there's really strong similarities there. So I don't know what that says about the dating of both sites and what's happening. So Alex, I just agree with you, and I think that's an area that needs to be explored further. Yeah, okay. So has the hole in the skull been differentiated from? No, we haven't done any formal wear studies or so forth of that hole. So we're not clear whether it's pierced or drilled, and haven't speculated what might have been the purpose from it. I don't know whether you might be able to reflect on that from what you know about holes in skulls. I don't know much about holes in skulls. The different diagnosis of the hanging of the skull. We have in one other structure, O45, which is the best preserved, and which is the only one that seems to have burnt down, possibly deliberately. We've got scattered on the floor pieces of a cranium, pieces of a mandible, the cranium, and so forth. We can't see any grooves or holes in that, but it doesn't appear to have come from the displaced burial. So we think it was actually displayed in that structure and got smashed when the walls collapsed. And then Jeffrey, yes, the huge empty area between the north and south. Well, I imagine that is partly a consequence of arch research, but I think it's also a consequence that, you know, when you look at the clusters of north and south, they're within these great river valleys. That's the natural place of cluster. But I do think that empty space in the middle is important. And sites such as out in Adazrak and Shubaya that we've heard from Tobias and others recently, I think they are really important sites as connecting people from the north and south. in terms of that chain of connections. So I think the research that we're finding out happening out in those eastern dry deserts of Jordan are really critical to understanding how the Neolithic emerged and perhaps became more elaborated further in the south and further in the north than in that so-called empty middle area, which I think is culturally absolutely critical. I think that's all the questions.
Yeah.
Is it? Oh no, hang on. Oh.
They are new. They will keep coming until you say, yeah.
Okay. Do I have to answer them all?
It's about the water supply.
Well, okay. So Pascal is saying that they built the replica during the dry season, mainly using irrigated water. In the PPNA, it would have been more water in the Wadi, so it would have been fine to build outside of the winter in terms of the water supply, and easy for getting the mud to dry. Yeah, it may have been possible. I think all I'm saying, it would have been that much easier in the winter as well, when I think that developed a little wetland down there. And I don't think there were people at this site all year round. I think there were people in their winter, a small number of people doing some maintenance, but the gatherings in the spring or in the autumn, I think they needed all their architecture there. So I don't think they'd have been doing that maintenance time at then. But of course, we don't necessarily know. But the quantity of water, I'm still quite staggered by, and the quantity of PZ architecture that we see.
Well, there is a comment that you are free to answer.
What is
either answer or not.
Places or whatever they can indicate such periods could refine the approach, thus a change that Neolithic niche microregion. Yeah, I mean, I think WF16 could provide a really, I think it's an ideal case study to explore this transition from the Epipaleolithic through into the PPNA. But if somebody would like to give me another £1 million to go and excavate it properly, I'd like to do that. We've only skimmed the surface of this site. We've only managed to take, I think, at most 20% of the deposits. And I'm sure sitting under them is a wonderful stratified sequence of Epipaleolithic, but I don't have any money to excavate them. So if Rosalia's got some money, I'd delighted. Or if anybody else would like to go and excavate the site, be my guest, because I think it's a site with a wonderful opportunity for providing a transition. Yes, indeed.
No, what I think that is very interesting is that this flow of ideas, concepts, or
yes,
whatever, is shows peaks in certain periods, and there are periods with the things. So
yeah,
it is, the rhythm is not the same. So it's very important to see at what time something happens, and that what you said about reinterpretation of concepts in its area is very important, because when it is presented like that, we always think, yes, they were moving all the time. Yes, they were moving, but at what time you have this peak of
yeah,
which is the most important.
No, thank you. I think that's absolutely right, because if you look at the functions of these social networks, they're about food security, they're about reproductive security, they're about building cooperation, building trust, resolving conflict. And you might think that they would be particularly important during periods of immense social disruption. When is that going to be? It's going to be a period of rapid climate change, when resource distribution is changing. And it's also going to be at a time of economic change, when, hey, somebody's got this bunch of goats and they're sort of tame, and look, we can milk them, and hey, somebody's actually growing some plants there. And this is really disruptive to that hunter-gatherer economies. So it would be at those times that I'd expect there to be an intensified amount of energy in these social networks, new concepts being formed, more social gatherings, and at other times during periods when there might be more stability, there would be less change and flux and energy flowing through these networks. Yeah, so that's a really good point. Thank you. Yes, indeed.
I thank you.
Okay, I think we exhausted you, Steve. There are no more questions. So I'm passing the right of speaking to Gunesh. There is just, there is something.
There's something about
the bench with the zigzag decoration.
He says, can I say something more about it? I'm afraid not. I mean, it's beautiful to look at. It's wonderful to excavate. It's absolutely intriguing. And I would like others to comment about any significance they see of a similarity or not with Jeff Lamar. Is it purely coincidental, or is there a theme going on there, which might then be reflected in Sophia as Petter is describing there? I don't know. I mean, really, that's the questions I've thrown at the end. Are all these similarities? Are they all just coincidence? Don't they have any significance, or can we read something into them? I don't